There's a bell hidden in a place where sound itself seems to die. It hangs in darkness, untouched by time, wrapped in layers of dust so thick the air feels frozen around it. No wind reaches it, no echoes return from it, and yet it waits. People say that if you strike the bell, nothing will happen. No chime, no vibration, no sound at all, just silence. But that silence is not empty. It listens, because somewhere, far away from where the bell hangs, a life will end. No warning, no connection, no visible cause. A man walking through a crowded street suddenly collapses. A woman falls asleep and never wakes again. A heartbeat stops, clean, precise, absolute, and no one understands why. Until someone finds the bell, until someone touches it, until someone dares to strike it. And in that moment, they begin to realize the truth. The bell was never meant to make a sound. It was meant to be heard by something else, something that never forgets. Jian Mo had spent years chasing things that shouldn't exist. Cursed objects, forgotten relics, fragments of rituals buried deep beneath history, he had encountered them all. Mirrors that reflected figures that weren't there. Talismans that bled when burned. Rooms that whispered even when completely empty. But the temple was different. It did not appear on any map. Not in records, not in stories, not even in the scattered notes of those who studied the supernatural. It existed beyond intention, hidden behind a forest that seemed almost alive in its desire to keep people out. Paths twisted unnaturally. What should have been a straight trail curved back into itself. Landmarks shifted when he wasn't looking. Even the light felt wrong, dimmed, as if filtered through something invisible, something watching. By the time Jian Mo found the temple, he no longer trusted his sense of direction or time. The structure stood in silence, ancient yet untouched, not ruined, not decayed, just abandoned, preserved in a way that felt unnatural, as though time itself had been forced to flow around it instead of through it. He stepped inside. The air changed instantly, heavy, still, oppressive. No insects buzzed, no wind stirred, no distant sounds crept in from the forest outside. Nothing, just silence. His footsteps echoed too clearly against the stone floor, sharp, deliberate, then suddenly stopped echoing at all, as if the space itself couldn't decide whether to acknowledge his presence. The walls were lined with statues, or what remained of them. Their bodies were intact, but their faces were gone, chiseled away deliberately, leaving behind smooth, blank surfaces where identity should have been. Talismans hung in long, decaying strips, their ink smeared and faded beyond recognition. Whatever purpose they once served had long since been erased. And at the center of the temple, something waited. Jian Mo slowed his steps. There, suspended in the air, was a bell. It did not hang from a beam. There was no rope, no chain, no visible support. It simply existed, perfectly still, perfectly centered, as if the space itself had been built around it. It was smaller than he expected. Dark metal, dulled by age, covered in thin cracks that spread across its surface like veins. Strange symbols had been carved into it, intricate, deliberate, but completely unfamiliar. They weren't protective. They weren't summoning. They didn't resemble any known form of ritual marking. They felt wrong. Jian Mo stepped closer. The closer he got, the more the silence seemed to deepen, not quieter, but heavier, pressing against him, wrapping around his thoughts, dulling everything except the presence of the bell. He stopped just inches away. There was no clapper inside, no mechanism, nothing that suggested it could ever produce sound. And yet, he knew. This was not something meant to be ignored. Slowly, he raised his hand. For the first time since entering the temple, he hesitated. Not because he was afraid, but because something deep inside him, something instinctive, undeniable, was telling him the truth. This was not a discovery. It was an invitation. His fingers hovered just inches away from the bell. For a moment, Jian Mo simply stood there, staring at it, as if expecting it to react before he even touched it. The silence around him felt thicker now, pressing against his skin, slipping into his thoughts. Then, slowly, he reached forward. His fingertips made contact. Cold. Not the kind of cold that came from metal left untouched, but something deeper, something that didn't stay on the surface. It seeped inward, sliding past his skin, threading through his veins, settling somewhere deep inside his chest. Jian Mo's breath caught slightly. He didn't pull away. Instead, he steadied himself. Then, with a small, controlled motion, he tapped the bell, lightly, carefully, testing. Nothing happened. No sound, no vibration, not even the slightest movement. The bell remained perfectly still, as if it had absorbed the action without acknowledging it. The air did not shift. The silence did not break. For a brief second, Jian Mo felt a flicker of doubt. Had he been wrong? Then, everything stopped. Not the world, not the temple, just him. His heart ceased. There was no pain, no tightening in his chest, no warning signal from his body, no gradual slowing. One moment it was beating, the next it wasn't. Gone. His body locked in place, his lungs froze, unable to draw breath. His muscles refused to respond, his vision sharpened unnaturally, every detail around him becoming painfully vivid. The fine cracks running through the bell, the dust suspended motionless in the air, the faint tremor in his own outstretched hand. Time stretched into something unnatural. 1 second, then another, and another. Each one longer than the last. He could feel the absence, not as emptiness, but as something deliberate, as if something had reached into him, found the exact mechanism that kept him alive, and simply turned it off. His mind screamed, but his body could not react. 2 seconds. 3, then. It returned. His heart slammed back into motion violently, like something forcing it to beat again. Air rushed into his lungs in a sharp, uncontrolled gasp as his body collapsed backward, his knees hitting the cold stone floor. He choked on the sudden breath. Once, twice, again. Each inhale ragged, uneven, desperate. His hands trembled as he pressed them against the ground, trying to steady himself, trying to understand what had just happened. "What was that?" he whispered hoarsely. His voice sounded fragile, uncertain. There was no answer, only silence. The bell hung exactly as it had before, still, unmoving, untouched, as if nothing had happened. But Jian Mo knew better. He had felt it. That moment, those 3 seconds, had not been an illusion, not a trick of the mind, not a physical anomaly. It had been exact, precise, measured. Something had acted on him with intention. Something that understood exactly where life began and where it could be stopped. Slowly, his breathing began to stabilize, but the unease remained, because whatever had just happened, it had not been random. It had been controlled, deliberate, like a test, like something had reached into him, paused his existence, and then decided he could continue. Jian Mo lifted his head, his gaze locked onto the bell once more. This time there was no curiosity left, no doubt, only realization. This wasn't an object, it was a mechanism, and he had just activated it. That night, someone died. Jian Mo didn't hear about it until the next morning. By then, he had already left the temple, though the feeling of it clung to him like something that refused to let go. The silence, the weight, the moment his heart had stopped. He tried to rationalize it as he walked back towards civilization. Fatigue, stress, a temporary lapse in his body's rhythm. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. When the report surfaced, it was buried among countless others. A man in his mid-40s, no prior medical history, found collapsed in his home, no signs of struggle, no external cause. Cause of death? Unknown. Jian Mo stared at the screen longer than he should have. Something about it felt aligned, not connected in any logical way, but timed, precise. His mind replayed the moment in the temple, the touch, the silence, the 3 seconds his heart had stopped, and then the death. It was too exact to ignore, so he went back through the forest that twisted and shifted, as if it remembered him. Back to the temple that stood untouched by time, back to the bell that hung in perfect stillness, waiting. This time there was no hesitation, no doubt, only intent. Jian Mo raised his hand and struck it again. Silence, the same as before, complete, absolute. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then somewhere far beyond the temple, another life ended. He didn't see it, he didn't hear it, but he knew. The certainty settled in his chest like a weight, heavy, unavoidable. He returned to the city immediately, and this time he watched. Hours passed. Then the report came. A woman, early 30s, found unresponsive in her apartment. No signs of trauma, no underlying illness. Cause of death, unknown. Jian Mo didn't react, not outwardly, but something inside him tightened. He went back again and again, each time repeating the same action, each time the same result. One strike, one death, no delay, no deviation. It didn't matter how hard he struck the bell, didn't matter how softly, didn't matter how long he waited between each attempt. The outcome never changed. Silence, followed by death. Jian Mo began documenting everything. Times, locations, victims. He built a timeline, mapping each strike to each death with obsessive precision. At first glance, the victims seemed unrelated. Different ages, different occupations, different lives. No shared background, no overlapping histories, no visible pattern. Random, completely random. But randomness doesn't behave like this. It doesn't align so perfectly. It doesn't respond. 3 strikes, 3 deaths, 5 strikes, 5 deaths. Always equal, always exact. No more, no less. Jian Mo stopped sleeping. The moment he closed his eyes, he saw it, the bell hanging in darkness, waiting to be struck again. He stopped eating, barely noticing the passage of time as his world narrowed down to a single, consuming question. What was he doing? Was he killing them? The thought clawed at him, relentless and suffocating. Because if he was, then every strike was a choice, every death his responsibility. But there was another possibility, one that felt even worse. What if he wasn't the cause? What if the bell didn't create death, but triggered it? What if those people were already meant to die, and he was simply the one sending the signal? Jian Mo stared at the data spread across his desk, the lines, the timestamps, the perfect alignment between action and consequence. His hands trembled slightly, because if that was true, then the bell wasn't a weapon, and he wasn't a killer. He was something else, something far more dangerous. He was the one pressing the button, and something, somewhere, was answering. The 4th time he struck the bell, something changed. At first, it was almost impossible to notice. A subtle shift, a distortion so slight it could have been dismissed as imagination. But Jian Mo had spent too long chasing the unnatural to ignore it. The silence felt different, not quieter, not louder, just heavier, as if it was no longer empty, as if something had begun to fill it. He stood perfectly still, his hands still hovering near the bell, his breath shallow and controlled. He hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't even allowed himself to think too loudly. And yet, he knew. He wasn't alone anymore. The temple had not changed. The broken statues still lined the walls, their faceless forms frozen in place. The torn talismans still hung motionless, their faded ink unreadable. The air still thick, unmoving. But the feeling, the presence, it was new. Jian Mo turned slowly, his movements deliberate, careful not to disturb whatever had shifted. Nothing, no figure, no movement, no sound, just the same suffocating stillness. But his instinct screamed at him. "Who's there?" he asked. His voice came out wrong, flat, stripped of depth, as if the sound had been swallowed before it could travel. The temple did not respond, or rather, it did, just not in a way he expected. At first it was barely there, a whisper, so faint it could have been mistaken for the echo of his own thoughts. "We were waiting." Jian Mo froze. The words didn't come from in front of him, or behind him, or anywhere at all. They came from everywhere, layered, overlapping. Dozens of voices speaking at once, merging into something that was neither singular nor separate. Not human, not entirely. His chest tightened, his pulse quickened. The air felt colder now, not physically, but internally, like something was reaching inside him again, brushing against the place where his heart had stopped before. He took a step back, then another. His gaze snapped back to the bell. It hadn't moved, but it didn't feel still anymore. It felt active, awake. This wasn't just cause and effect. This wasn't just a mechanism responding to input. Something was listening. Something had noticed him. And with every strike, it was getting closer. Jian Mo's thoughts raced, trying to hold on to logic, onto reason. But reason was slipping. Because whatever this was, it was aware. And awareness meant intention. He swallowed hard. There was only one way to be certain. One more test. One final strike. If something answered again, then he would know. Know that this wasn't coincidence. Know that he wasn't alone in this. His hand trembled as he raised it toward the bell. For the first time since this began, he hesitated out of fear. Not fear of death, but fear of what might come after. Of what might be waiting beyond the silence. His fingers touched the surface. That same cold seeped into him instantly. Deeper this time, familiar, expectant, and then he struck it. Silence, absolute. The kind that pressed against his ears, against his skull, against his thoughts. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the whisper returned. Stronger, closer, clear enough to understand. We remember. Jian Mo's breath caught. The voices were no longer distant. They were near, too near. The shadows around the temple shifted, not in movement, but in form, stretching, thickening, as if something inside them was trying to emerge, trying to take shape within the darkness itself. The edges of the room felt unstable, like they were bending inward, narrowing the space around him. He stumbled back, his heart racing uncontrollably. This wasn't death. This wasn't a simple exchange. This wasn't even something that could be explained. This was something older, something patient, something that had been waiting far longer than he could comprehend. Waiting for someone to strike the bell, waiting for someone to call it. And now it knew he was there. Jian Mo stopped using the bell, not because he feared what it could do, but because he feared what it already had done. Each strike had confirmed something he could no longer ignore. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't probability. It wasn't some obscure chain reaction he didn't yet understand. It was precise, deliberate, and worst of all, it was consistent. So he stepped away from the temple, not to escape it, but to understand it. Because whatever force was behind the bell, it was not finished. And if he continued blindly, he wouldn't be uncovering the truth. He would be feeding it. Jian Mo returned to the city and buried himself in research. Not recent cases. Those were too chaotic, too filled with noise. He needed something older, something overlooked, something that didn't make sense. He began digging through archived records, hospital files, police reports, forgotten case studies, incidents that had been dismissed, explained away, or simply abandoned because no one could understand them. At first, the cases seemed unrelated. A car crash where every passenger died, except one. A building collapse that crushed dozens, but left a single survivor untouched. A man pronounced clinically dead for several minutes, who suddenly regained a heartbeat. A prisoner whose execution failed, not once, but twice, before being quietly released due to procedural complications. A woman diagnosed with a terminal illness, who recovered overnight without explanation. Miracles, that's what people had called them. Unexplainable survivals, second chances. Jian Mo didn't believe in miracles, not anymore. He compiled the cases, dozens at first, then hundreds, each one carefully documented, names, dates, locations, circumstances. He mapped them out, cross-referenced timelines, searched for overlap. For days, nothing aligned, just noise, just fragments. But Jian Mo kept going, because deep down he already knew. The pattern was there. It had to be. Then slowly, it began to surface. He compared the list of recent deaths, the ones that occurred after each time he struck the bell, one by one, methodically, and then it clicked. Every single victim had a record, not just any record, a moment, a single point in their life where they should have died, but didn't. The man who collapsed in his home, 10 years earlier, he had survived a highway collision that killed everyone else in the vehicle. The woman found unresponsive in her apartment, she had once been declared dead during surgery, for nearly 4 minutes before suddenly stabilizing. Another victim? A construction worker who had fallen from a high rise and walked away with barely a scratch. Each one the same. Each one had reached the edge of death and stepped back. Jian Mo leaned back in his chair, staring at the data spread across his desk. His mind slowed, not from confusion, but from realization. This wasn't random. It wasn't selection. It wasn't even judgment, it was correction. The words settled into his thoughts like something heavy and unavoidable. Correction. Something had been keeping track, watching, recording, every anomaly, every deviation, every life that had continued when it shouldn't have. And the bell wasn't the cause. It was the trigger, a signal, a command. Each strike didn't create death. It activated it, directed it, pointed something toward those who had escaped. Jian Mo's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the desk, because that meant one thing. Those people weren't chosen at random. They were already marked, already accounted for, already part of something far larger than he had imagined. And with every strike, he had been calling something that corrected mistakes, something that did not forget, something that did not forgive. His breath slowed, because another realization followed immediately after. If the bell only affected those who had cheated death, then its reach was limited, defined, precise, which meant not everyone was in danger, only those who weren't supposed to still be alive. The room felt colder, quieter. He looked down at the list again. Names, faces, stories, all connected by a single moment. The moment they should have died, and didn't. Jian Mo closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. There was only one thing left to confirm, one final step. He returned to the temple. But this time he wasn't searching, he wasn't guessing, he wasn't experimenting. He understood. As he stepped inside, the air felt familiar now, heavy, silent, waiting. The statues remained unchanged. The talismans still hung in lifeless strips, and at the center, the bell, still suspended, still motionless, still watching. Jian Mo approached it slowly, not with hesitation, but with awareness. His gaze traced the surface carefully this time, the cracks, the texture, the symbols, and now he could see it, what he had missed before. The carvings weren't random, they weren't decorative, they weren't even symbolic in the traditional sense. They were structured, organized, repeated with variation, like entries, like markings, like records, a ledger, a list, a memory etched into metal. Each line representing something, someone, a life that had slipped through the boundary it was never meant to cross. Jian Mo felt his chest tighten slightly, because the bell didn't just exist, it remembered, and everything it remembered would eventually be reclaimed. It doesn't kill, Jian Mo whispered, his voice barely carried in the suffocating stillness of the temple. This time the silence did not swallow his words completely. It lingered, thin, stretched, as if something within the space was allowing them to exist, as if something was listening. It calls. The realization settled into him with a weight far heavier than fear. For a long time, he had tried to understand the bell as a weapon, a cursed object, a mechanism of cause and effect, something that created death with each strike. But that was never true. The bell didn't create anything. It signaled. It reached outward, beyond the temple, beyond distance, beyond logic, and touched something else, something that had always been there, waiting. Every strike was not an act of destruction. It was a summons, a recall. Jian Mo's eyes remained fixed on the bell as his thoughts aligned, piece by piece, forming a truth he could no longer deny. Each death had felt immediate, instant, but not random, never random, because the victims were not chosen. They were found, already marked, already known, already recorded somewhere beyond human understanding. People who had crossed a line they were never meant to cross. People who had reached the exact moment where their lives should have ended and continued anyway. The bell didn't judge them. It didn't decide their fate. It simply reminded something else. And when that thing was reminded, it acted. Jian Mo exhaled slowly, though the breath felt heavier than it should have. Every strike, he murmured, is a signal, a pulse sent into the dark. Not asking, not demanding, just informing, telling something ancient, something precise, something inevitable, that a correction was needed. His mind returned to the records, the accidents, the miracles, the impossible survivals. Every single one of them had broken a pattern, a timeline that should have ended, but didn't. And the universe, if that was what this was, did not forget. It did not lose track. It did not forgive errors, it corrected them. Jian Mo's fingers tightened slightly as he stared at the carvings etched into the bell's surface. What he had once mistaken for meaningless symbols now felt painfully clear. They were not incantations, not warnings, not protections. They were entries, records, a ledger carved into metal, each line representing a life that had slipped through the boundary of death, each mark a reminder that something, somewhere, was keeping count. And the bell was how that count was answered. Jian Mo's thoughts slowed, because beneath all of that understanding, beneath all of that logic, there was something else, something personal, something he had avoided confronting since the beginning. His gaze lowered slightly. "What about me?" he whispered. The question lingered in the air, not unanswered, but unchallenged, because deep down he already knew. He closed his eyes, and the memory came back instantly, sharp, clear, unavoidable. The moment, the one he had buried beneath years of denial and distraction. The incident where everything should have ended. The moment where his body had failed, where the world had gone dark, where time had stopped, just like it had when he touched the bell. The same stillness, the same absence, the same impossible return. He had survived, not by effort, not by chance, but by something that had no explanation, something that had allowed him to continue. Jian Mo's chest tightened, a slow, creeping cold spreading through him, not from the bell this time, but from the realization itself. He had never questioned the problem, never allowed himself to think about what it meant, because the alternative was too heavy, too final, too absolute. But now, there was no avoiding it. His eyes opened, slowly, deliberately, and they returned to the bell. "I'm on the list," he said quietly. Not a guess, not a theory, a fact. The same way the others had been marked, the same way their lives had been recorded, the same way their deaths had been waiting. Jian Mo let out a slow breath because everything finally made sense. He had never been investigating the bell. He had never been separate from it. From the very beginning, he had been part of it, part of the pattern, part of the correction, and every strike he had made had brought something closer, not just to them, but to himself. Jian Mo stood before the bell for the final time. The temple felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. The silence no longer felt like an absence. It felt full, dense, watching, waiting. He understood it now, every part of it. There was no confusion left, no doubt, no fear born from the unknown, only clarity and something deeper than fear, acceptance. He stepped closer to the bell, his footsteps slow and deliberate against the stone floor. The air pressed in around him, heavy, almost resistant, as if something within the temple was aware of what he was about to do. Or perhaps it had always known. Jian stopped just inches away. The bell hung motionless before him, its surface dark and cracked, its symbols carved deep into the metal like scars that had never healed. A record, a memory, a list, and his name, though unseen, was part of it. He let out a slow breath. "If it's a correction," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the weight behind it, "then finish it." The words did not echo. They settled, absorbed into the silence as if the temple itself accepted them. His hand rose. No hesitation, no trembling, just intention. He had spent his life chasing the unnatural, trying to understand it, control it, define it. But this was never meant to be controlled. It was inevitable. His fingers touched the bell. The cold returned instantly. But this time it felt different, not invasive, not searching, familiar, as if whatever force lay behind the bell no longer needed to reach into him, because it already knew him, already recognized him, already had him. Jian Mo didn't pull away. He didn't pause. He didn't question. With a steady motion, he struck the bell. Silence, absolute, complete. The kind of silence that erased everything else. There was no transition, no moment of anticipation, no space between cause and effect, because this time, there was no delay. His heart stopped, instantly, cleanly, without resistance. No pain, no struggle, no desperate attempt to breathe, just stillness. His body remained upright for a moment, frozen in place, as if time itself had paused to acknowledge the completion of something long overdue. The world around him dimmed, not fading, not darkening, but simplifying, stripping away everything unnecessary, leaving only the essential. And in that final moment, Jian Mo understood. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't judgment. It wasn't even death in the way humans understood it. It was balance, a correction, a line that had been broken, now restored. His body began to fall, slowly, almost gently, as if the temple itself had released him. And as he collapsed, something shifted in the shadows. They didn't move toward him. They moved away, receding, withdrawing, as if their purpose had been fulfilled, as if whatever had been waiting was no longer needed. The presence that had filled the temple, that had pressed against him, that had watched him from the moment he first struck the bell, it faded. Not completely, but enough. Enough to leave the space empty again. Still, silent, unoccupied. Jian Mo's body lay motionless on the cold stone floor, unmoving, unbreathing, unchanged. There was no mark on him, no sign of what had happened, no evidence of the force that had reached into him and ended everything with such precision. Because there had never been anything to see, only something to know. The bell remained suspended above him, unshaken, unchanged, as if nothing had occurred, as if it had simply completed its function. And now it waited. The temple returned to stillness, not gradually, not slowly, but instantly, as if everything that had filled the space, every presence, every whisper, every unseen observer had withdrawn the moment its purpose was complete. The air grew heavy again, dense, unmoving, silent, empty. Jian Mo's body lay on the cold stone floor where it had fallen, motionless and undisturbed. His expression remained calm, almost peaceful, as if whatever had taken him had done so without struggle. There were no marks, no wounds, no signs of interruption, only absence, the absence of breath, the absence of life. Above him, the bell hung exactly where it always had, unchanged, unmoved, unheard. Its surface remained dark and cracked, its carved symbols etched into metal like memories that refused to fade. If anything had shifted, if anything had been resolved, the bell did not show it, because it didn't need to. Its purpose had been fulfilled, for now. Time passed. Not in a way that could be measured easily. Inside the temple, there was no difference between moments, no sunlight to mark the hours, no sound to signal change, just stillness. Days slipped by, then weeks. Dust settled slowly over Jian Mo's body, softening the edges of his presence until he became just another part of the temple, another shape in the silence. Eventually, the world outside began to move again. Somewhere, someone noticed he was gone. Questions were asked, searches were made, but the forest did not guide them, the paths did not lead them, and the temple did not reveal itself because it did not need to be found. Not yet, but it would be. Because places like this are never truly lost, only waiting. Waiting for the right moment, the right person, someone curious enough, desperate enough, or lost enough to find it. And one day someone would. They would step into the forest, unaware of how the path would twist beneath them. They would follow instinct instead of reason. They would ignore the subtle warnings, the feeling that something was wrong, and eventually they would arrive. At the temple, at the silence, at the bell. It would hang there just as it always had, unmoving, unremarkable, easy to dismiss, easy to misunderstand, and they would feel it, that quiet pull, that subtle curiosity, that need to know. They would step closer, just as Jian Mo had. They would hesitate, just as he had. And then they would reach out, because that is what people do. They seek, they question, they touch the things they shouldn't, and when they do, the bell will be waiting, and somewhere in the world, a life will end. Not randomly, not violently, not unjustly, but precisely, exactly as it was meant to, as if something was keeping count, as if something had never stopped watching, as if something had never forgotten. Because death does not rush, it does not lose track. It does not forgive mistakes, it simply waits, patiently, silently, until the moment comes to correct it. If you were given a second chance at life, would you truly accept it? Knowing that somewhere beyond what you can see or understand, it was never meant to be yours. That one day, without warning, without reason, something would come back to take it, not out of anger, not out of cruelty, but simply to restore what was broken. So tell me, if you ever found that bell, would you walk away, or would you risk everything just to hear what silence sounds like?